Okay, so good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. So tonight's event is about climate governance, COP26, and the importance of youth involvement at COP26. My name is Mark Baker. I'm the co-chair for the Students for Global Health Coordinator team, and I'm going to kick today's event off by just giving a short 10-minute presentation on an introduction to climate governance at COP26, before passing over to Nathan Thanki later. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to quickly be covering what is climate governance and thinking about climate governance on a global picture. And then I'm also going to be talking about a brief introduction to what COP26 is before handing over to Nathan. So climate governance is a problem and an idea which is quite difficult to define. So climate change, as I'm sure we all know, is a long-term shift in average global weather patterns due to an increase in average temperature. On the left, I've listed the 8 main causes and emitters of greenhouse gases within countries. And these have led to an increase in temperature since pre-industrial times. This webinar series is about climate justice, which is the idea that climate change is not just a physical or environmental issue, it's a political and it's a cultural issue. And when we consider that in the frames of climate change, we can also then start to consider climate governance, which has been defined as diplomacy, mechanisms, and response measures aimed at steering social systems towards preventing, mitigating, or adapting to the risks posed by climate change. I appreciate it's a very widely definition, but it is an area which is hard to define because it's how kind of governing bodies and groups are able to change and steer society in such a way that we can be more friendly towards the planet and we can be ultimately with the aim of reducing the impacts of climate change. And I would like to think about this for the next few minutes in a global picture. And if we look on the left at the 8 main contributors to greenhouse gases, the impact of kind of global governance on this can be huge if we start choosing clean energy sources and improve our transport and reduce aviation. For each of these 8 areas, the impact of kind of global governance and global coordination to reduce the impact of on climate change of all of them, it's a really huge area. So when we think about global climate governance, the main overarching body that deals with, sorry, I'm just admitting people to the meeting. The main overarching United Nations body is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. So this is an international treaty that addresses climate change that was signed in the 1990s. And the decision-making board is the Conference of the Parties, COP, which meets every year. So this year is COP26, which will be held in Glasgow. In 2020, there were 197 signatories. And so of all of the UN nations and parties, it's a significant amount. And between them, they have been able to produce really quite impressive and kind of the first ever massive international treaties, which we're going to speak about here. So in 1997, the first international legally binding climate change agreement was signed, which was the Kyoto Protocol. This bound 38 countries within the UNFCCC to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 5.2% from 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012. This was a really momentous agreement because it was the first time that there was ever actually a legally binding contract with countries to say that we had to cut emissions by this amount. Now this period actually ended in 2012. And unfortunately, although many countries were able to meet their targets, during this period from 1997 to 2012, global emissions actually increased by 30%. In response to this, a second commitment period, the Doha Amendment, was actually agreed upon and is coming into force from last year, which again is a legally binding agreement for, I believe it's 42 countries, also to make reductions, which are legally binding. In 2009, which was near the end of the first Kyoto Protocol agreement, a document was signed, which was this accord. And this is not a legally binding document, but it did take note that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. And it was actually recognized by all members of the UNFCCC at the time, which I believe was 186 parties at the time. And there were new greenhouse gas emissions targets set by almost all of the member states. However, this was not legally binding. So it's been criticized in this paper, 3 models of global climate governance in the bottom left, as not being that effective, as there was no legally binding agreements made. Then in 2016, this was one of the most recent large amendments formed by the UNFCCC, and this was done at the 21st Conference of the Parties. This was negotiated by 196 countries to produce legally binding commitments to keep average temperatures down below 2 degrees and preferably down below 1.5 degrees temperature increase from pre-industrial times. This was almost you could see as a continuation of the Kyoto Protocol and a legally binding version of the Copenhagen Accord. And it's been in the news a lot recently because, of course, of the Trump administration leaving the Paris Agreement and now the Biden administration joining back in. Apologies. I'm struggling to go back. But I was just going to speak there to the future of global climate governance. And when we're looking forward and when we're looking towards COP26, we're going to have to be thinking about forming Green New Deals, and we're going to have to be thinking about how we can keep on track for the Paris Agreement as we are still seeing rises in carbon dioxide emissions. And this brings me on to COP26. So the COP26 is the 26th conference of the parties of the UNFCCC. It's going to be hosted in Glasgow, UK, in partnership with Italy, as it was meant to be hosted last year, but of course, due to coronavirus restrictions, it's being hosted this year, and Italy, who was meant to be this year's host, is holding it in partnership. There's a real pressure, I think, this year for the UK to appear as climate leaders in a post-Brexit era, as internationally, having left the EU, we are in a slightly weak position. So I feel on this international platform, there really is a pressure for the UK government to appear as a leader. And it's being the UK COP26 delegation is being led by Alex Sharma. And the event will be held at the SEC in Glasgow. And if any Glaswegians are watching or any Scottish viewers, they have just started to sign up new volunteers to help at COP26 if you want to get involved in this really quite exciting event. So with that very brief introduction to climate governance and what COP26 is, I'm going to pass over to Nathan Thanki. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. I will also need to have sharing permissions so that I can share my screen and a few slides with all of you.
There you go, just done that.
So that's done, great. Give me 1 second. Okay, so yeah, thanks for that overview of climate governance and of the UNFCCC and some of the processes and agreements that have been reached underneath it. I'll do a little bit more of that, but I'll also talk a little bit about how civil society and maybe young people in particular can get involved. Before that, I'll introduce myself in case anyone missed the flyer. My name is Nathan Thanki. I am one of the co-coordinators for the global campaign to demand climate justice. One of the focal points for the climate justice constituency at the UNFCCC, and I'll explain a little bit about the constituencies and how civil society is organized within the formal process. Just to pick up, I think where Mark left off, covered quite a lot of this, but I've got one of the main sort of objectives, underlying objectives of the Framework Convention there on the screen. So it's really about stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations to avoid dangerous interference with the climate system. So an objective that is, I think, by any measure, we have failed to achieve so far. Few important things to note just about the kind of governance questions before we begin properly. The framework convention itself is just that. It's intended to be a framework. There was always intended to be many more treaties and agreements reached. So that's the little timeline that Mark showed you speaks to that, with the Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, and so on and so forth. So it's an ever-evolving kind of governance that's quite big. And the COP, when we talk about COP and COP26, we're usually referring to the annual summit, but of course the COP itself is the highest decision-making body of the Framework Convention. There are other bodies that meet at the same time. So COP26 in Glasgow will see the COP meeting, but it will also see the decision-making bodies for the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement meeting, as well as subsidiary bodies that are permanent and serve all three. So just worth noting that. But on to sort of, I think, how to think about climate governance, maybe more generally, beyond the sort of facts about what it is and what's happened. I think, as Mark had also said, climate justice as a framework is fundamentally about power. And I think that basically we need to understand the governance around climate change in a kind of historical context. So as, struggles between the core and periphery, or the colonizer and colonized, that take various forms in international relations and use various terms. In the United Nations, it's generally terms that we use are developed and developing, although they're obviously contested terms. But the result of this is that the outcomes that emerge from this process will inevitably reflect existing power imbalances. So that's sort of what this cartoon is attesting to. It's probably worth noting as well, as many of you might have done, the extent to which the process is captured by corporate and elite interests, because obviously our governments are generally captured by corporate and elite interests. And that's something that overlaps with the sort of north-south divide. So there's layers to the ways in which power is functioning at the UNFCC and at these meetings. So as activists, we're often severely limited in what we can and can't do within the space. But in contrast, corporate lobbyists and sponsors are literally, they have the red carpet rolled out for them. There's no conflict of interest policy at the UNFCCC. And it's not only the major polluters in some of those sectors that Mark mentioned, particularly energy and agriculture, but kind of profiteers of all description that take advantage of that fact and see the COP as a way to make money rather than as a way to achieve the ultimate objective, which is to stabilize the climate. So this is a photo I took at the end of COP25, which the sign collapsed and the talks very nearly collapsed as well. So this is quite a good image of that. But this is a recurring theme within the UNFCCC and the COPs. You'll often, if you've paid attention over the last few years, just to the headlines, you would have seen stuff like, close to collapse, we go into overtime, lots of tension, lots of confusion, a sort of mood of things falling apart and things failing. We can explain that somewhat by the fact that we've had rogue states like the United States hell-bent essentially on undermining the regime. So we had a regime with the UNFCCC. This sort of climate governance story starts in the late 80s with the first intergovernmental panel on climate change report. And it began with a very, scientific, logical approach, which was about, we have this much left that we can emit if we want to stay at this temperature. Okay, let's set some targets to do that. Let's set some timetables. It was that kind of logic. The United States never liked that logic and never signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first sort of operationalization of that approach. and instead tried to reverse course and have a deregulated approach to climate governance, whereby every country would bring their own target and be their own judge, jury, and executioner. So this is a fundamentally different approach to other environmental problems that we've dealt with successfully, because it's a sort of, they're of a different nature. So if you think of successful agreements like the Montreal Protocol that dealt with the ozone layer and the hole in the ozone, that's a very specific and narrow part of the economy that just had to be phased out. Industries that produced CFCs. The problem with climate change is that it's obviously, carbon is sort of built in or wrapped around the economy, or rather the other way around, the economy is wrapped around fossil fuels. So we have this fact that it's a much larger problem, much more complicated to deal with. We've got a lot of bad faith actors in the process, corporate and state, who want to avoid a real reckoning with the sort of underlying structural problems or structural reasons for causes of climate change. So we end up having quite bizarre outcomes where there's no mention of fossil fuels, where there is a collective target or collective goal of staying below 1.5, but no allocation of who is going to do what within that. No dividing up of the pie, and where instead we allow pie in the sky ideas to flourish around net zero and sort of balancing act between sinks and sources of carbon, where we rely on the market and various market mechanisms to somehow reduce emissions sufficiently. And the whole thing becomes not about addressing the crisis, but about being perceived to be addressing the crisis while actually perpetuating it. Yeah, so I think if you just heard that, you might be asking yourself, why bother? And that's a very good question, because on the one hand, we don't need the COP at all, in the sense that climate policy, the setting of national targets, a regulatory framework that governments could implement domestically, and rein in the polluting industries and transition them in a fair way. None of that is dependent on the COP happening. That is stuff that our countries and governments could be getting on with anyway. So we don't need the COP for that. But on the other hand, like we all know, the climate change is a global problem. It's not going to be enough for every country to focus on its own, what it can achieve within its own borders, within its own territory, in a sort of, in a vacuum. We need global cooperation. When you add to the story the fact that many countries are severely disadvantaged because of historical processes like colonialism, and also particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, it becomes all the more imperative to sort of adopt collective approaches to the problem, particularly when it comes to dealing with the impacts, sharing technologies to mitigate not only the impacts, but also the causes, so to mitigate emissions, and to allocate finance in ways that are fair and in ways that enable countries to really do climate action. We would also need a global forum to kind of have a collective assessment of what we're doing, and is it enough? And if not, who needs to do more, and where and how? So all of that speaks to the need for something like the COP, if not the COP itself, then some type of climate governance that is functional. But the COP's also a very important stage for global South countries, for developing countries to collectively voice their demands and to collectively negotiate in a manner which is less likely, but still results in divide and rule from the sort of the core countries, the developed countries. It's just that they have more chance in a bloc like the Group of 77, which is the main developing country negotiating bloc, to have a common position and to be able to stand up to pressure and sometimes outright bullying from the powerful countries. That said, the UNFCCC is dominated by the rich countries. It is dominated by the international financial institutions, by multinational corporations, and the outcomes, as I said earlier, do reflect their interests rather than the interests of the global majority. But acknowledging that and realizing that is one thing. Changing it's another thing. So we're not going to change it by not engaging. It requires strong social movements to confront governments in all arenas of struggle. And so the UNFCCC emerges as one important arena of that struggle. It does mean that you also sometimes get, as an activist, as civil society, you find yourself in sort of tactical alliances. So we'll have movements lending critical support to developing country governments, even if in some instances, social movements from those countries are fighting with their governments at home. In the international arena, they would actually be supporting them on various issues. So the photo here is a good example of that from 2012 at the COP in Doha, when there was a huge push from developing countries to fight for an acknowledgement of the impacts of climate change and to begin negotiations on what they call loss and damage. There was an absolute reticence from many developed countries, from the United States, from Australia, Japan, and the European Union, to even acknowledge this, to recognize it, and to talk about it. But civil society was very adamant, was waiting outside this, at 3 a.m, all sorts of hours, of the smallest negotiating rooms, forming lines, very clear with the message, and doing whatever protests were allowed. So the COP is also a stage for us as social movements to protest, to lend that critical support, to do lobbying of our own, to platform our demands, to help shape a narrative, to pressure, to share knowledge, to build our own networks. So it's an incredibly important stage for that. I alluded to, and you probably can imagine, that the range within which protest, or the range of protest that's tolerated within the UNFCCC is quite narrow. So this photo from 2011 in Durban shows that was the year of, Occupy Wall Street was very live in people's minds. But this shows you kind of the response when the anger from the streets kind of pours into the halls of power, because it really feels like another universe stepping into the UNFCCC. It's a very stale, very sterile atmosphere. But sometimes there's a break and that energy kind of rushes in. So 2011 was one such moment, but this was the response, almost, quite a militarized response. And COP often involves a militarization of the host city as well, and making the possibility of direct action, more difficult, similar to the G20 and G7 meetings. But worth noting that, in the early COPs, in 1995, I think the COP in Berlin was, the plenary was stormed by activists who held some banners and stuff. Last year in Madrid, at the COP, we saw a near storming of the plenary, and the result was that 300 people were ejected from the COP, kicked out onto the streets, and sort of frog marched around some strange closed motorways outside the venue. The point is that when there's too much frustration, it will boil over. It's amazing that even happened in Madrid, because, as I said, the conditions are they're not really conducive to this sort of thing happening at all. It's very stale, it's very formal. Everyone has, a lanyard with a badge that's associated with an organization that risks losing its status at the UN if one of its delegates misbehaves. So they have a very tight leash on civil society. But even still, 300 people were ejected because they were so angry about the direction of the talks. Sometimes the only thing we can do is walk out ourselves. And that was what happened in Warsaw in 2013. It wasn't an abandonment of the process. It wasn't saying that we're done with this, because, as I said, it's always an important stage and an arena of struggle. But it was a moment at which we wanted to voice a collective frustration. I think we do need to think, beyond the institutional approach, absolutely. And it's probably fine that sections of the climate movement, don't want to devote energy to the COP. But in my opinion, at least, it's very naive to think that we're going to get climate justice by going, coal plant to coal plant and shutting them down. Even if, there's a lot of good reasons why we should do that as well, and why site battles like that are important. It's just to say that the COP is, it will matter for as long as it goes on, even if to who and in what ways kind of changes. So yeah, as I said, civil society is kind of reduced because of the restrictions on what we can actually do in terms of direct action, largely to kind of jostling for media attention. So sometimes we've got photo opportunities, more often than not we've got press conferences, and then we've also got speeches. Sometimes they go viral, as this one did, but it's really, a 2-minute intervention at 3 a.m. to a room full of less than 100 sleeping delegates who are, paper pushers in some ministry somewhere. They're not key decision makers, but it's a stage for sharing our message more than trying to convince those particular delegates of anything. I'd like to speak a little bit, just because you might be interested to know, who's able to take those kinds of opportunities. So this is a bit of a breakdown in terms of who's there. The overwhelming majority, you'd be unsurprised to know, of civil society comes from the global north, from the core, from Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the US, and Canada. And they fit in this, so this pie chart showing the constituencies that the UNFCCC kind of pushes us into or organizes us into. And you can see the overwhelming majority is within the ENGO, so the NGOs, the environmental NGOs constituency. You'll see there that YOUNGO, which is the youth constituency, the women and gender constituency, the IPO, which is Indigenous Peoples Organizations, and the trade unions constituency are all not very well represented in terms of the overall representation within the COP. The three main players are the research, who have to be neutral, so they are like just observing, and it's important, but in terms of doing the more aggressive and doing that kind of critical support, they're not able to do that, so it falls to ENGO. And the majority of ENGO, as I've said, is from the global north. So it's sort of unsurprising when the demands kind of follow the interests of NGOs from Europe and North America. So I think, as people entering into the COP, we all should ask ourselves this key question that is from the COP in Katowice in a couple of years ago, in 2018. And that's, whose side are you really on? Because the space is so dominated by those northern NGOs, who are they themselves dominated by a very professionalized middle class, who are, there's nothing wrong with being a middle class professional, but usually that means you're not accountable to social movements, to communities on the front line in the global south or even in the global north. You're mostly accountable to donors. And so the interest that you end up serving will at best be in conflict, because you're trying to serve donor interests while also serving maybe a moral imperative that you feel or that your organization has set. So when you enter the COP, you have to kind of ask yourself that question about what are the demands that you're advocating for. And so movement demands have been quite consistent over the decades. We're really calling for fair shares, that every country takes their fair share of climate action, of the collective action, that includes an increase in sharing of the means of implementation. Some of us talk about it in more maybe like justice-based terms. We talk about climate debt and reparations, but there's ways to talk about that in more neutral ways, which is this essentially the same demand. And these demands are really long-standing. And they're very much about changing the system, of being anti-imperial, anti-racist, being for a just transition for labor, and so on and so forth. Just because we're, I think, mostly us in this call in the UK, and because the UK is the host of the next COP, it's important to know kind of what that fair share would be that I mentioned. So it's not a net zero by 2050 or by 2030 or by 2025, to be very clear. That's not in the realm of fairness. For the UK to actually do its fair share, given its responsibility and given its capacity, it would need to be at 200% below 1990 levels by the year 2030. So when you hear demands or the call for net zero by 2050 or even earlier, I kind of like to think about it as the climate equivalent of like a herd immunity strategy that the government has. So it's sort of knowingly saying that, yeah, people are going to die, but our economy, some lines on the graph of GDP we think might be affected better if we let them die. And so there's a lot of magical thinking as well that goes into this sort of assumptions about the future, which again has a lot of parallels with the current crisis around the pandemic. But I've talked for quite a long time now, so I'll wrap up there and maybe we can have some discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you, Nathan. That was really, really interesting. I think if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I certainly have some questions, so if you're happy for me to, I'll start this off. So looking towards COP26 this year, do you have any, so you spoke a bit about how it's kind of a stasis and it can almost just be a political for show. Do you have any kind of significant fears moving into COP26 this year compared to previous years?
Yeah, I have at a couple of levels some fears. The main reason that the COP failed in Madrid and nearly went off the rails in Katowice the year before that was because the last element of what they call the rule book for Paris. So we agreed the Paris Agreement in 2015, but it was agreed in like a very hectic 2-week period where there was a lot of pressure, not a lot of sleep. So there's a lot of the details of how that would actually be implemented that were very ambiguous at best. So in the years after the agreement was signed and then ratified, the parties have been trying to figure out how they would implement it. So they've been coming up with all these rules for implementation. They mostly agreed that, but there's one section of the Paris Agreement that they don't have the rules for, and that's Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement deals with, or it should deal with, it's about cooperative approaches to climate change, but that has been largely reduced down to market mechanisms, so offsetting and the like, as a way to deal with climate change. So not about fundamentally reducing emissions, but about maybe afforesting, so planting trees. And then, if you look into the detail of previous kind of offset schemes underneath the UN, such as the Clean Development Mechanism, they're very dubious, lots of human rights violations, lots of environmental integrity questions, like they didn't end up actually reducing emissions. So there's still a lot of money floating around, not going towards keeping fossil fuels in the ground or even averting emissions, or even capturing emissions, as if we could somehow do that, which the technology doesn't really exist for yet, other than trees and healthy forests. So Article 6 is the thing that they have not got agreement on yet. And that's because there's differences between the countries. Some of the forested countries, Brazil, wants to be able to have more credits that would carry over. And the fight between the states is a bit technical and a bit less interesting than what the fundamental objection from movements is, which is that these market mechanisms are a false solution to dealing with climate change. So there's a big push this year to frame COP26 as being successful if they can agree those rules and if they can establish a way to set up, if they can essentially set up a global carbon trading system that would help countries, supposedly help countries meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement. But this would largely mean passing responsibility on to developing countries in a way that would be unfair. So there's a lot of reasons to object to it, but that's the main game for COP26. So there's a lot of concerns about that at the kind of more technical level. And I think at a more like narrative level, a big fear is that because the UK government is leading it and they're I mean, incompetent in many ways, but have you know, an army of diplomats and a very compliant domestic media, which also happens to, you know, because the reach of the BBC and some of the other British media is very, it's global and influent, and it's the ripple effects are global. They're very likely to control kind of the whole story. And so the worry is that they'll be able to say that climate change is broadly being dealt with, that, yeah, we need to do more, but like we've got this kind of ambition coalition and the UK is a real leader. And before you know it, kind of we're all parroting back, you know, Downing Street talking points without even realizing it, rather than actually, you know, providing some opposition, some dissent, some critical assessment of what they're doing. We don't seem to be seeing it from the official opposition in Parliament, so it kind of relies on civil society, and that would be one of my greater fears around COP26.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think something you touched on there was that this shifting of blame to low-income countries. And Gertrude has just asked in the chat, probably in relation to one of the graphs you shared there, what makes other countries, like countries in Africa, have a low representation in such forums?
So that was it was a representation of civil society rather than parties. So you will get like huge delegations from some countries. And yeah, I don't have the sort of raw data for that in the presentation, but from the civil society side, it's the same sort of reasons you can think maybe off the top of your head. Visa restrictions are quite severe. The cost of going to a COP is immense. You know, the accommodation skyrockets. You have to often eat at the UN itself in the venues. It's very expensive to just feed yourself. And when I was going as a student, it was like you're kind of bringing cereal bars and surviving off that, free chocolate, and the only thing you're spending money on is coffee, kind of thing. So it's, I mean, maybe some of you can relate to that outside of the COP, but in the COP it's kind of worse. I think it's like a nonstop, you know, kind of finals period, and yeah, so it means that it's harder for anyone to come. And when you look at where the COP has been held, more than half of them have been held in Western or Eastern Europe, but Eastern Europe means Poland because of the way the UN allocates it. So, you know, coming to the country and financing yourself to do so is such a big barrier for a lot of civil society from the global south. I think when you add into that the fact that many of the movements are more grassroots rather than dealing with policy advocacy, that also features in. So we've got like huge movements in various parts of the world, particularly in Asia and Latin America, that are active at a regional level and at a national level, but don't attend the COP or send one representative to attend. And that's also speaking to the kind of power imbalance that exists in civil society, because you might, in the youth constituency, for example, you might have somebody who, there could be 10 or 12 people in a delegation from a university in the UK who are all attending and all active in that space. And then there could be one person who has been chosen and is actually speaking on behalf of like tens of thousands of people from their network or organization. Similarly, in the farmers constituency, you have a representative of La Via Campesina, which has millions of members in it, and they're only one person, but they're sort of speaking for that many people, sitting alongside someone who is representing like Monsanto or something. So there's a lot of barriers. Yeah.
And just within that, is there a push within the UNFCCC to, I don't know, almost fund or help people who are representative of these groups? Is there a move for increased representation?
So the UN does finance developing country delegates to attend, and there's some daily allowances that they collect, and there are problems that like our colleagues and comrades in developing countries will point to around sometimes certain governments like sending people basically on holidays, and further undermining the ability of developing country as a bloc to kind of stand up to the developed countries. But there is no support in a consistent manner for civil society. So when I was a focal point for the Youngo in 2015, we did get funds from the Norwegian government to bring about 30 people for COP21 in Paris. And I think the youth constituency continues to try and do that, but it's very hand to mouth. And it's like a lottery, and you've got hundreds and hundreds of applicants for those, 30 funded spots. So it needs attention.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I think we have a question from Veronica. What do you think the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic could have on outcomes from COP26, if any?
Yeah, it's kind of the question on everyone's mind at the minute. We're not sure because a lot of the outcomes are really crafted in advance of the COP. A lot of the preparatory work that goes in happens in what they call intersessional. So there are these permanent bodies that meet to provide the technical and technological assistance to the negotiations, and they meet usually in June in Bonn in Germany. The UN Secretary General was in the news last week, I think, calling for those negotiations to move online as a result of the pandemic. His argument is that you can't have an outcome in COP if you don't have the prep, if you don't do the legwork in advance, which is obviously true. So he's saying that therefore they have to go online. A big fear from many, and there's, I don't think that there's like a clear right and wrong about this, but a big fear is, and I think a very well-founded one, is that moving online, there are just as many issues around equitable participation, even though in theory there shouldn't be, because it should be cheaper, and with technology we should be able more easily to have conversations without having the cost of flying everybody to one place. But the reality, of course, is that that's not true. It's not only that we've got inequitable access to the internet because of where the literal cables are lie around the earth and under the oceans and stuff, but different capacity to pay for that service where it does exist. Electricity, there's 1 billion people on earth who don't have access to electricity. I'm not saying that that might not be a problem for states, for government, but it's certainly a problem when it comes to civil society participation. So there's not a lot of, I think there's a lot of fear around how inequitable the participation would be if it went online. Going online would also, I think, inevitably affect the outcomes because of the time that would be taken away from coordination, the difficulty in doing that coordination for the developing countries in particular. How do you coordinate between Chile and some the small islands in the Pacific? The time range that covers is huge, so it's impossible to find a decent time. So there's a lot of things that go into it that would make it harder. So I think that the pandemic is inevitably going to affect the outcomes. At a political level, I think if it happens in person, there'll be a lot of attention and desire to kind of call it a success because they've had a meeting of leaders, and that in itself is a success after the pandemic. And there'll be lots of photo ops for Boris, in a mask or not in a mask, shaking Biden's hand and that kind of thing, and saying we've done it, and it'll be the front page splash on November the 12th, the day after. But in terms of the political level, there may be sort of some announcements around the recovery, economic recovery, that could come out of it, but that is kind of in the up to them. That's not something that's on the official agenda that would be affected or not. But I think, yeah, it's not just going to be for this year either. It's going to be for every subsequent COP. That question around, who's going to be able to attend or not? Are we going to have like a kind of vaccine apartheid globally? Is that going to affect things? Obviously, it will. So yeah, it's a question that has many possible answers, but none that are definite.
Okay, thank you. And thinking about moving online, we have a question from Dorothea about your view on online protests. So Dorothea feels that they don't get noticed at all, but it's hard to find alternatives. So if COP26 does go ahead and is online, how else can people get involved? And do you think online protests is a suitable medium?
Yeah, I think that's a question a lot of activists are asking themselves, and it's a really good one as well. Again, I don't have like answers. I think these are answers we need to come up with collectively. I mean, my personal view is we should actually look more into like the hacking community and think really creatively, because I agree with you that, like a hashtag and getting people holding a sign with a hashtag and a message is something, but it's quite a limited thing to do. And it's quite rare that those, generally break outside the bubble, and that anybody that, isn't already taking part in that action would even see it or care. So I agree that it's a fairly limited form of protest, and I think that, but I do think that there are other forms of online protest that we maybe haven't explored so much yet that we could, that are maybe more subversive and creative, that involve, crashing the party, or like yes men type stunts as well. They've done some good online pranks that I think have been effective, setting up fake websites and making fake announcements on behalf of Shell and others. So there's maybe ideas to be explored there.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a question from Rhiannon, who would like to state she's not an expert in this, but she would like to ask, how does global governance of trade interact with climate? She feels that the World Trade Organization aims and objectives seem to mostly be in contrast with what we need for climate action.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm also not an expert in trade. I think if you want to have like a global trade justice perspective, I would head over to or just Google Third World Network, who do a lot of they follow the WTO quite closely. The aims and decisions of the WTO tend to rub up against the underlying objective of the climate convention. They also have, it's a very different process. So some people want to talk about, we could leave because trade is so essential, and because we would need to really have a climate agenda within the WTO to see real emissions reductions. And that's an argument that a lot of people make. And I think that's kind of the kernel of maybe, or it's embedded in Rihanna's question there. There's a line of thought that goes that you should sort of do that instead of focusing on the UNFCC, which doesn't have enough teeth to kind of force. It's all very well and good. They make nice announcements, come up with some plans, have big summits, but they don't actually, it's not like, real economy kind of thing. And therefore we should focus on WTO. But one of the obvious problems with that is that in the WTO, it's not, the power imbalances are even greater because of the way in which the decision making is set up. So it's not a real democracy. It's like dollar for a vote instead of a consensus or theoretically consensus based model in which every party is equal.
With that, something I wanted to ask about was, you mentioned that researchers are able to participate, but they don't have a vote, and they're not able to kind of take a side. Why is that? Because in my eyes, research is clearly quite one-sided.
It's not that they're not allowed to take positions by the UNFCCC. I mean, they could get up and say, I'm speaking on behalf of whatever university of whatever from the constituency of research and independent NGOs. And I really think that this thing that this country said is a load of shit and I condemn it. You could say that, and you know, barring the swear word, maybe nothing would happen to you, and there'd be no repercussions from the UN. Other constituencies do that. It's that constituency, for whatever reason, has a notion of impartiality and covers, I think, you know, a wide range of political perspectives. So they opt for that. And you'll find that within a lot of constituencies, because they cover such a range of viewpoints. You know, there's nothing inherent about being young in terms of what your politics are, as we all know. So the youth constituency, you know, the only criteria are, I think, that you're under a certain age. And even then, I'm not even sure that that's strict. So it's like self-identifying. So you could be like right-wing, like even extremely right-wing, and be in that space. And that would, because they have a consensus-based model as well, really affect what people could say on behalf of the constituency. So it's sort of a flawed, or it's a flaw in that system. Some of the other constituencies have higher degrees of alignment, like the climate justice constituency has some tactical differences about certain questions, but by and large is very aligned. And happily, I think we're seeing an increasing alignment between the constituencies as well. I'm seeing that the next question is on human rights, and that's actually one of the areas where there has been a very successful alignment between Indigenous peoples, women and gender constituency, young people, and the environmental NGOs, all kind of, and trade unions, all kind of having a cross-constituency approach to fighting to get language about human rights into the sort of framing of the Paris Agreement. They had mixed levels of success, but so it's not in there as an article, but there is in some of the preambulary text there's a mention of certain rights. But again, you know, there's also people there's a range of views. So some people think that human rights are pitted against or weaponized against certain states who, for, you know, whatever reason, like don't want to be on record as like supporting them, and they get kind of caught, they get twisted up in knots trying to avoid that, and then it becomes like a line of attack from countries that have no intention of honoring human rights themselves, but are happy to be double-faced about it. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, like, climate change is the ultimate violation of human rights. If we, you know, stopped climate change, we wouldn't stop all human rights violations, of course, but it's a major violation of human rights. So there's a lot of connection between the two. I'm not sure if that fully answered that question, but that's what I understood from it.
Thank you. Okay, and just in the final few minutes, just to wrap this up, as my first question was what are your fears, on a more positive note, what are your hopes for COP26? I
mean, it's like the flip side of my fears, I guess. So I hope that we're able to prevent the establishment of false solutions and the further entrenchment of a logic of the logic behind these false solutions. You know, which is that we don't need to change the system. We can just rely on the future promise of some magical technology to save us, and, you know, also the elites that own that technology, because of course Elon Musk is interested in, you know, preservation of the human species rather than just himself. So that's a great hope, is that we can deliver that message very clearly, and that can be like one of the uniting forces and things that we all get behind within civil society. And we say that carbon markets, geoengineering, and these other sort of like, dangerous distractions are just that, and that we reject them, and that if we pursue them, we'll make the problem worse. And that instead we have these real solutions, and then it becomes a bit more like, you know, specialized, because I think everyone has their own thing to talk about, their own sort of details of the bigger vision of transformation. But, you know, maybe some of the frameworks that have emerged in the last few years, and conversations that are happening around a global, just, transition, sometimes called a global Green New Deal in North America and the UK. But that's language that doesn't always land in other contexts culturally. That as a general framework, reparative framework, can be put forward as like things that we need to urgently start discussing and talking about. How are we going to phase out the fossil fuel industry in a way that doesn't just like abandon entire countries that their whole economy is dependent on that, and so the lives of millions of people are indirectly dependent on that. How can we do that in a way that is fair, but also in line with the demands of 1.5 and staying below it?
Fantastic. Well, Nathan, thank you so much. It's just gone 7 o'clock, so I think we will end it there. But thank you so much for sharing your experience and speaking to us. That was really valuable. And thank you to everyone who's come along and attended all of these webinars. A huge thank you to Rhiannon and to Veronica, who played really important roles in organising this last month's worth of webinars. So thank you all for coming, and please stay engaged with the social media. This recording will be posted up on the YouTube if there are any other parts that you'd like to go back and have a listen to again.
Can I just, before you wrap up finally, can I just plug the COP26 coalition? Because I think maybe people might want to get involved. I know that Students for Global Health, like various members, are already involved at different levels, but I'll maybe just share a slide, which I forgot to share earlier, so this is completely my bad. But yes, we have this big coalition now in the UK around COP26. It's got trade unionists, it's got migrant justice groups, racial justice groups, it's got some of the youth strikers, so young people, it's got other students, it's got some of the big NGOs, it's got like the solidarity networks that are based here in the UK that maintain connections with communities in the global south. So everyone's very welcome. We've got a structure that's set up into working groups. We have a fortnightly newsletter. We have our own speaker series, webinar series that covers similar topics about everything you want to know about the UN negotiations. We organized a sort of online summit at the end of last year. We're organizing part 2. It's called From the Ground Up at the end of March. We're planning an in-person People Summit, touch wood, for November in Glasgow, and everyone's really, really welcome to join. Maybe you can go on the COP26coalition.org to sign up to the newsletter, get more information, and just find out more in general.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Alrighty. Unless you have any other organizations to talk about, I will stop the recording there. Thank you so much, everybody.